The economy that we are working with, our hypothetical economy, to illustrate the basic Keynesian model, reveals to us the unique equilibrium which occurs when the economy's GDP is 100. Remember, what happens here is with GDP of 100, with an income flow of 100, in other words, the flow of planned aggregate expenditure is also exactly equal to 100. There's no divergence between GDP and planned aggregate expenditure. We have the equilibrium condition for this economy satisfied. It can be a bit cumbersome working with a table like this all the time. So what I want to do is take this information that we've collected about planned aggregate expenditure and illustrate it on a diagram. So the diagram we've already started to construct. It has planned aggregate expenditure measured on the vertical axis and the economy's GDP measured on the horizontal axis. And then all possible points of equilibrium are represented by points on the 45-degree line. Remember, by definition, any point on the 45-degree line satisfies our condition for equilibrium, because any point on the 45-degree line will correspond to where planned aggregate expenditure and GDP are equivalent. The question we need to answer now is which of those possible points of equilibrium will actually emerge as the economy's actual equilibrium. To answer that question, we take all of the information we've collected so far on planned aggregate expenditure and illustrate it on the diagram. So let's start with planned injections. You'll recall that planned injections can be represented visually by a horizontal line in this particular framework, where the fact that this line is horizontal reflects our assumption that the spending plans of firms, government and foreign residents are exogenous, so they don't vary systematically with current GDP. Using the numbers in the table that we've been working with, the economy's planned injections will have a numerical value of 40. The next component of planned aggregate expenditure relates to households, and households' expenditure plans are summarised in the consumption function. Again, using the numbers, the hypothetical numbers from that table, the consumption function can be illustrated in this instance by a positively sloped line with a vertical intercept of 15 and a slope of 0.45. I'd ask you to recall that the slope is influenced both by the marginal propensity to consume and by the tax rate. So those two lines are actually incredibly informative. They tell us everything we need to know about the expenditure plans of every sector in the economy. There's nothing missing here. We've got households' expenditure plans, firms' expenditure plans, governments' expenditure plans, and foreign residents' expenditure plans. It's all there. And if we combine that information, if we take planned injections, in other words, and add it to household consumption, we end up with a complete representation of this economy's planned aggregate expenditure. You'll see that planned aggregate expenditure has a positive slope. In fact, it has the same slope as the consumption function. That's important because it reminds us that planned aggregate expenditure has a significant endogenous component. In other words, because variations in income lead to variations in household consumption spending, variations in income also lead to systematic variations in planned aggregate expenditure. So planned aggregate expenditure has an endogenous component. It's different for different flows of income. But it also has significant exogenous components, primarily coming through those planned injections, but also remember that consumption itself has some exogenous elements. So planned aggregate expenditure in total has both components that are exogenous and endogenous. The point at which planned aggregate expenditure crosses the 45-degree line is very significant for us. That point represents the economy's equilibrium. The way to understand that point, or the way to interpret it, is as follows. Should the economy's GDP or aggregate income be equal to 100 units, then taking into account both the exogenous spending plans of firms, government and foreign residents, and also taking into account household spending plans which are influenced by what the flow of income is, then in total the economy's planned aggregate expenditure will also equal 100. So that one unique point on this diagram, the point at which the planned aggregate expenditure line cuts the 45-degree line, represents the equilibrium. Now, simply saying that that represents the equilibrium is not saying that that is necessarily what we will observe in the economy. All we have done in this slide is identify where the equilibrium is. All we've really done in this slide is take that information from the table I asked you to work through and illustrate it on a diagram. We have not yet established that the economy will be at equilibrium. We don't know that yet. All we've done here is identify what the equilibrium is. Now, before we establish whether the economy is at equilibrium, I just want to show you a third way of establishing where the economy's equilibrium is. We've done this two ways now. We've done it through the table. We've done it through the diagram. Sometimes it's convenient, and also as a check, to calculate what the economy's equilibrium must look like using some simple algebra. So let's just do this as a check. We know the economy's planned aggregate expenditure can be represented by this little equation here. We use that information in the construction both of the table and of the diagram. We know that in equilibrium, the economy's GDP must equal planned aggregate expenditure. So in equilibrium, this must be true. So what you're really looking at is an algebraic way of saying in equilibrium we must have GDP equivalent to planned aggregate expenditure. Apologies, we should add the extra 40 there as well. Here I've just done it for you, but you can check if you like. We have an equation where we have y on the left-hand side and y on the right-hand side. So simply solve that equation for y, bring those two income terms onto the left-hand side of the equation, and you can soon see that the economy's equilibrium flow of GDP is indeed 100. This is just a quick back-of-the-envelope way of establishing what the equilibrium must be, making use very much of the concept that equilibrium is where GDP and planned aggregate expenditure are equal. So I don't really mind which way you do it, either the diagram or this, though from here on we're going to work primarily with the diagram. So let's just summarise. We have a very complete representation of planned aggregate expenditure now. We have our three exogenous components of planned injections, and I've just made up some numbers there, 10 for planned investment, 20 for government, 10 for exports. We complete the story of planned aggregate expenditure by including the very rich detail we have about households' consumption plans, noting that those plans have both an exogenous and an endogenous component. And we've seen that in this particular instance, once we know all of this structure or detail about planned aggregate expenditure, the economy's equilibrium must be 100 units of output. But as I was saying previously, identifying what the equilibrium must look like doesn't tell us whether the economy will actually be at that equilibrium. And so that's the question we must now address. Are there any automatic forces in the economy that guarantee that the equilibrium will actually be achieved? Will the economy, in other words, be in equilibrium? To answer that question, we need to add one more assumption to the model. It's a very important assumption. It's actually quite central to the Keynesian model. It's an assumption about one of the things that might motivate firms' production decisions. What we're going to assume is that when firms observe unplanned changes in inventories, they take that as a signal. They take that as a signal that tells them that they've gotten their production plans wrong, that the amount that they're producing doesn't match exactly the spending plans of the economy. And that firms will, if they ever observe this situation occurring, adjust their production plans accordingly. If, for example, firms unexpectedly see an increase in their inventories, remember they're not expecting this, to their surprise, they're seeing that they're not able to sell everything that they've sold, they'll understand that means that they're producing too much. And in response, they will cut back their production. So an increase in inventories leads to a reduction in production. If, on the other hand, they see the opposite occurring, if they see unexpectedly that they're having to dip into their inventories to meet demand, so that their inventories are unexpectedly declining, firms will understand that means they've underestimated what the strength of expenditure will be in the economy, and that will act as a signal for firms to increase their production. So firms are assumed to respond very systematically to unexpected changes in inventories. And that assumption is going to be absolutely key to understand what I've called the transitioning to equilibrium, or what we're really doing here is answering the question, will we know that the economy will eventually be in equilibrium? Or would we expect the economy to be in equilibrium? Take the following example. What we have here is an economy not in equilibrium. What I mean by that is we have an economy, I'm going to assume, producing 120 units of output. The problem is that if we take the corresponding planned aggregate expenditure that we would expect to see should the economy's income be 120, we see that that planned aggregate expenditure falls short. What the planned aggregate expenditure schedule tells us is that with income of 120, the various sectors in the economy are only planning to spend 109. So we're clearly not in a world of equilibrium. We're in a world where the economy has produced too much relative to what the sectors of the economy are planning to spend. As a result, there will be an unexpected increase in inventories. There'll be unplanned investment, in other words. It'll be 11 units. Firms have produced 120, but they're only ever going to be able to sell 109. There are going to be 11 units of inventory accumulated unexpectedly. So you're looking at a disequilibrium. but you are not looking at the end of the story. And that's because of our previous assumption. Firms observe this happening. They see, to their surprise, that they're accumulating unsold inventory, unsold stocks of inventory. What do? Well, our assumption from the previous slide tells us that firms adjust their production downwards. They stop producing so much. They've taken this as a signal they've overproduced, so they cut production. Remember, production and income are the same at this aggregate macroeconomic level. A decision by firms to cut production means this economy's GDP will fall, this economy's aggregate income will fall. What happens in this framework when income falls? Well, with an income of 120, that's where we are on the consumption function. As income falls, households revise their consumption downwards, and that's shown by a movement down and along the consumption function. Put simply, households find their income falling, and therefore they cut back on their consumption. Consumption, of course, is an important component of planned aggregate expenditure. So if we're moving down and along the consumption function, we are also moving down and along planned aggregate expenditure. And these movements will continue for as long as firms are experiencing an unexpected increase in inventories. Once we reach this point, however, we have correspondence between what firms are producing and what the economy is planning to spend. We no longer have this unexpected increase in inventories. Firms therefore stop adjusting production. They keep production at 100. That production of 100 exactly matches planned aggregate expenditure, which is also 100, and we have reached the equilibrium. So what this analysis tells us is that if we have a disequilibrium where firms have overproduced, that will set a chain of events in process that eliminates that disequilibrium and moves the economy to its equilibrium. It can work in the other direction as well. Suppose we have a situation where production is 80. Now, with production at 80, we have planned aggregate expenditure of 91, and we read that off the planned aggregate expenditure schedule. What we have here is a situation of underproduction. At an income level of 80, firms have produced less than what the economy sectors are planning to purchase. What firms will experience is a change in their inventories, but in this case it's a unplanned reduction in their inventories. To meet that planned expenditure of 91, firms will have to use their previously accumulated stock of inventories to provide the extra 11 units, the difference between the production of 80 and the firm's planned expenditure of 91. So we record that as unplanned investment of minus 11. Inventories are being reduced. But that's not the end of the story. Firms see this happening, it's taken them by surprise, and they take that as a signal, well, we better increase production. And now it's the opposite of the previous slide. As firms increase production, income in the economy increases. As income in the economy increases, households increase their consumption, and we showed that by a movement up and along the consumption function. Consumption's an important part of planned aggregate expenditure, so we also record a movement up and along the planned aggregate expenditure line. And this process continues until production hits 100, because at 100 the planned aggregate expenditure of the economy corresponds to production, There's no longer an unexpected change in inventories. The economy has reached its equilibrium. So this and the previous slide are really significant. What we've established here is that there are automatic forces in the economy that lead the economy to equilibrium. And so the equilibrium point is where we would expect the economy to be. Any disequilibrium is quickly eliminated either through the process described on this slide or the previous slide. We expect the economy will be at its equilibrium.